The 80s are often referred to as the decade of decadence, and for many are home to fond memories created by nostalgic pop culture ideals. However, according to Barbara Wackus Billings, historian and pop culture maven, the 80s demonstrated the beginning of a growing generation gap.
I didn't witness the Kennedy assassination. I was an infant or I wasn't even born when Martin Luther King was assassinated or Bobby Kennedy. So I'd never experienced those types of events. The Challenger was the first one. TV and video music was huge. My life as a high schooler and early college was built around, our plans were built around what video was premiering that weekend. And I think we were trying to figure out who we were compared to the 60s and the 70s. We were so different, dealing with completely different things. The AIDS epidemic and drugs, Just Say No. We were supposedly trying to learn from the mistakes of the 60s and 70s, but the guidance wasn't there to help us. One other thing I would add that I think is a good reflection of how some of us felt in the 80s is in Billy Joel's song, We Didn't Start the Fire. And it talks about all of the challenges and problems of the day, but as a result of previous generations. And it represented those of us at the time saying, we didn't do this. This isn't on us. This is on you guys back there. And maybe that's something that every generation feels as it's coming of age, but we had the opportunity to broadcast it differently. And I think, having said that, that's the difference in terms of pop culture and what was happening societally. We were able to talk about it and broadcast it in a much different and much bigger, broader way. I do think it was a very, very unique period that it will never be repeated. It just won't.
Another sizable aspect of the 80s was the music created then that continues to be popular today. Local musician and producer Jim Gress speaks about the variety of genres found during the time.
There wasn't one outstanding feature of 80s music. So, it wasn't like the British invasion, or it wasn't like the psychedelic era or the progressive rock of the early 70s or disco. In the 80s, I think largely what happened was that there was a mishmash of just so many different styles of rock and pop music. There was all kinds of crazy stuff going on. I mean, you could go to a jukebox and you could find everything from, country rock, Bob Seger, kind of Midwest rock, Prince dance music, the early parts of what became hip hop. Rap was getting going with Run DMC and some of those that kind of crossed over and got some pop play. So there was just so many different things going on that when you say 80s music, it doesn't really have, I don't think there's anything where you can say 80s music is. I don't think that there was a lot of I think in the 80s there wasn't a lot of music that was particularly socially focused. In the 60s you had a lot of music that was focused on being anti-war or pro-peace or something like that, and had some sort of social message. The 70s music was, you had glam rock and a lot of music that I would identify sort of with social excess, so sort of drugs and rock and roll kind of stuff is really more 70s than 80s. But I think 80s music, the reason it kind of had some staying power is because there is such variety. So there was kind of something for everybody, and a lot of people who liked 80s music or who grew up around that time became fans of just, no particular style, but of music that was good. And because there was such a variety of music, there were bands that didn't even have guitars in. So, you might be a fan of a band like Kraftwerk, which is all synthesizers and things like that. But you might also be a fan of a hair band, like Poison or Rat. So I think the reason it's had staying power is because it has so much variety. It's not like something like doo-wop music or 50s music where, if you say 50s music, there's a real style or kind of music that comes to mind. You think of Elvis, you think of, Fats Domino. There's that sort of doo-wop or early rock, or, if you think of the 60s, you pretty much either think of something like Motown in the early part of the 60s, the Beatles in the middle part of the 60s, and Jimi Hendrix in the late part of the 60s. There's a certain sound to that era that the 70s, the 80s don't really have, I don't think, a particular sound of the 80s.
Finally, society may most remember the 80s for the landmark cinema produced during the time. Librarian and cinema buff Heidi Andres sat down with me to discuss popular movies and the 80s cinema world.
I remember Back to the Future being big, Ghostbusters being big, the second Ghostbusters not so much probably, but it was because it was a sequel, but sequels rarely hold up to the original. I remember the Goonies being big, but that's because it's also a personal favorite of mine. Raiders of the Lost Ark and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. And then later in the 80s, movies like Fatal Attraction and Pretty Woman. I feel like the 80s movies you have sort of not subgenres, but subgroups you could put them in. Certainly like action adventure, like the Goonies and the Indiana Jones movies and Star Wars. Obviously that gets into sci-fi as well, and then you have your teen focus movies, the John Hughes movies, the Brat Pack movies. I prefer some of the types of cinematography tricks and sound effects that were done in 80s movies as opposed to movies of the 2000s, because I just feel like CGI and green screen and all these computer enhanced effects do not look as, not that they looked realistic necessarily in the 80s movies, but I feel like more attempts were made to use real materials to make the effects as opposed to just computer, and so they don't look maybe as phony or as enhanced. Certain movies of the 80s, I think, have aspects and elements and topics that, even though they were made in the 80s, still ring true. And even if the portrayal on film wasn't timeless, the subject matter was timeless. So, like, as I mentioned, nostalgia, so movies like Stand By Me, even though it's made in the 80s, it harkens back to the 50s, late 50s, I think is when it was set. Or Back to the Future, which bounces between the 50s and 80s. And, the themes in it, coming of age, trying to discover who you are timeless, no matter what era you grew up in. So even if a movie was made in the 80s and it deals with one of those topics, coming of age or self-discovery, and especially a lot of what we call the Brat Pack and teen movies of the 80s, the John Hughes movies, and even some that weren't made by John Hughes but featured his stable of actors. Everybody experiences those first heartbreaks and first crushes and proms and, rebelling against your parents. And certainly there were movies made before the 80s that dealt with those topics, but in terms of John Hughes movies, it was really the first time a director was catering to that younger audience. And so whether you were that age in the 80s when you watch them and you can watch them now and you feel like it's part of you because you grew up with it, or whether you were not alive in the 80s and watch them now, they still have timeless aspects that I think everyone can relate to.
For many, the 80s represented an era of excess, and for others it represented a decade of fond memories. No matter what you believe, it's still safe to say their spirit is alive and well.